Okay, by my time, it's noon Eastern time, so let's get started. So welcome everyone to the Rocky Worlds discussion series. Folks are still joining, but I'll just talk us through the schedule and plan for the hour while they're doing that. So we're going to have once I finish with my intro remarks, we're going to have a talk for about 30 to 40 minutes by our invited speaker. This is going to be followed by a plenum discussion, which I'll be moderating. And then we'll close the session after that. And so just a little bit of netiquette to remember while you're taking part in this discussion. Please, whenever you pose a question, use your full name. If you could keep muted throughout the talk, then that will be appreciated so we can avoid background noise. And if possible, please turn on your video whenever asking questions during the discussion. All right, so just to introduce myself, first of all, I'm Robin Wordsworth. I'll be the moderator. And it's my great pleasure to introduce Mathieu Lapôtre, who's our speaker for this session. So Mathieu is a professor of planetary science at Stanford University. And his work's sort of primarily focused on geomorphology, but it's really geomorphology that crosses the boundary from Earth to many other objects in the solar system in a way that probes process and looks for sort of universal themes that aren't dependent on any one particular object. And from what I can gather from his abstract today, he's going to be leading us on a tour through the solar system to show exactly how this kind of thing can be achieved in practice. So take it away whenever you're ready, Mathieu.
Thank you, Robin. Yes. Can everybody see my screen? Yeah, okay. All right, well, hi everyone. Thanks for dialing in. I'm very excited for the opportunity to talk with such a broad range of scientists. I'm not sure how many time zones are presented this morning, but thanks for dialing in, whatever time it is, wherever you are. You know, especially such a broad range of scientists whose common denominator is their interest in rocky worlds. When Tim reached out to me a few months ago, I went on the meeting's website to get a sense of the scope of past discussions. And I found that many of the topics that were previously covered sit somewhere within the intersection of the planetary sciences and astronomy, and a few of them at the intersection of the planetary and earth sciences. And I wish I could tell you that my talk would take us to the coveted intersection of astronomy and the earth sciences, but it will not. Instead, I'll ask the astronomers in the room to bear with me, as I'll take you solidly into the earth sciences today, focusing on planetary surfaces, and discuss how a dialogue between the earth and planetary sciences can help us to better understand the geologic history of rocky worlds. And specifically, I'll focus on how comparative planetology can help us to decipher the record of surface processes through a better understanding of their mechanics. An old paradigm in the geosciences states that the present is the key to the past, and I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, have heard this phrase before. And it means that we can understand what Earth was like in the past by inspection of modern geological processes on Earth today. A somewhat newer paradigm has been to acknowledge that geological processes need not be constant or uniform, and to use the physics of these processes instead, as we derive it from observations of modern Earth, to think about how these processes might have changed through time or varied through space to better interpret the geological records of Earth's past and of other planets. Now, an even newer paradigm, which is really only now kind of emerging, is to in turn make use of the geological processes occurring on other planets to better understand the physics behind them. And in doing so, to better understand the geological record of Earth, its past and its future. So over the next 35 minutes or so, I'll illustrate this point through 3 examples drawn from my group's research. And in my first example, I'll take you to Saturn's moon, Titan. And I'll tell you about how models for the formation of oolids on Earth might have provided the key to understanding the global sedimentary cycle of Titan. This work was born from a collaboration with Mike Malaska and Morgan Cable at JPL. So thanks to Cassini, Titan is now well known to be a sedimentary world with lakes and seas concentrated at high latitudes. There's abundant evidence for alluvial and fluvial environments. In light blue here, you can see everywhere a fluvial valley was mapped, which is basically just following Cassini orbital passes. And in green, I'm indicating mapped alluvial fans also found at a broad range of latitudes. And of course, the Huygens lander touched down on a dry riverbed right around that red cross here in the middle on the map, revealing rounded, light-toned cobbles, possibly made of ice, and fine, less than 2 millimeter dark grains, possibly organics. And finally, extensive fields of linear dunes have also been mapped all around Titan's equatorial region, shown in orange in this map. And from the morphology of dunes, sand transport directions were mapped, and it was determined that even though sand is primarily concentrated around the equator, some of it is redistributed from the equator towards the mid-latitudes, and the few aeolian features mapped at higher latitudes also show net transport towards those mid-latitudes. Now, in addition to lakes, rivers, and dunes, there are different types of terrains, which were characterized by distinct morphologies in radar and different spectral signatures that have been mapped. And some of these terrains have mysterious origins. For example, Titan's karst-like terrain, shown in magenta, called labyrinth terrain, and also the widespread undifferentiated plains shown in green, which don't really look like much in radar. It just kind of looks like static on an old TV. Well, we don't really understand the kinds of processes that shape these and how or whether they may be genetically related to any of the active sedimentary environments that we see on Titan. The dominant reservoir of sediment on Titan, of course, is the moon's equatorial dune fields, which not only are thought to be active, but they're thought to have been so for tens to hundreds of thousands of years. And from the mechanics of how windblown sand grains hop or saltate, we know that sand should be relatively well sorted because it's much easier to saltate a 200 micron grain under Titan surface conditions than it is to saltate a finer dust grain or a coarser pebble. Based on wind tunnel experiments and models, we think that Titan's dunes are likely made of 200 to 300 micron grains. So where does all that sand come from on Titan? Several mechanisms have been proposed to create sand-sized materials on Titan, which are illustrated here in this figure made by Barnes et al. In 2015, starting with flocculation of very fine grains into coarser aggregates when they are transported by a liquid. There is weathering of an evaporated crust that precipitated after some liquid evaporated, forming sand-sized particles. Sintering, whereby small grains coalesce into larger grains over time, largely through diffusive processes. And finally, lithification and subsequent weathering and erosion into sand-sized materials. Now you can see that all of these processes require the presence of fine, kind of micron scale particles to start. And these are largely thought to be derived from photochemistry high up in Titan's atmosphere, producing an organic haze from methane that generates fine-grained hydrocarbon compounds that will then rain down onto Titan's surface. On Earth and Mars, sand can be blown around by winds for very long times because grains are mechanically strong. But on Titan, the picture might be somewhat different. Specifically, the organic materials that are thought to make up the sand, which are simple organics and hydrocarbons analog to tholins, which we can recreate on Earth, are mechanically weak. And for example, here you can see that the Young's modulus of tholins is about an order of magnitude lower than that of silicate sand. And this finding led the authors of the original study to conclude that Titan sand likely is derived locally, close to the equatorial region, because the grains are too soft and too brittle to be transported over long distances. Now, although this hypothesis cannot be ruled out, it's unclear why sources would only concentrate around Titan's equator when organics should be produced everywhere on Titan's, in Titan's atmosphere. So here, I'd like to explore an alternative hypothesis that would allow for sand-sized particles to be produced anywhere on Titan and allow them to survive long transport distances and could explain the distribution of Titan's landscapes. And this is where ooids come into play. Okay, so what do ooids have to do with Titan? Ooids are these spheroidal, largely calcium carbonate grains, which you can see in the top left picture here, and that form on Earth in shallow tropical seas. The ones in the picture were sampled in Turks and Caicos, southeast of the Bahamas. Ooids almost look like beads, and if you were to cut them in half, you would see what you see in the lower left figure, a nucleus, usually a detrital sand grain, around which several concentric layers of calcium carbonate have precipitated. And that grain structure is thought to arise from the competing constructive and destructive effects of calcium carbonate precipitation on the one hand, when the grains are at rest, and abrasion on the other hand, when the grains are transported, for example, in high energy shoals. So here I'll test the hypothesis that sand is not necessarily generated only near the equator, but constantly regenerates through episodic abrasion when grains are transported and sintering when they're at rest, in a process that's analogous to the formation of ooids in Earth's shallow carbonate seas. Now, under this mechanism, grains are entrained and transported either by methane rivers or nitrogen winds. And as they get transported, they also abrade upon collisions, which will tend to decrease grain sizes. But when the grains are not transported, they may also sinter and coarsen through time. And this part of the process is a little bit different from ooid formation. We're not envisioning the grains to grow through precipitation here, but rather through a diffusion control coalescence of small grains into larger grains over time. And as grains episodically sinter while at rest and abrade while in transport, episodic transport may then conspire to produce a sustained supply of sand-sized materials that maintain an equilibrium grain size. Now, the mathematical framework for our working hypothesis is simple and states that grain size is set by the sum of abrasion when grains are transported and sintering when they are not, such that if grain size is at equilibrium, the sum of these two terms must be equal to 0. And we'll consider the case of abrasion in both fluvial and aeolian environments, as both are known to occur on Titan. Now, the I term here in the equation is the transport intermittency, or the frequency of transport events. Okay, so combining these instantaneous rates with transport intermittencies, you can make predictions of what transport intermittencies are required, shown on the y-axis, to produce an equilibrium grain size of a given value, which is then shown here on the x-axis. The orange curve shows predictions in the case where transport occurs 100% of the time by winds, and the blue curve 100% of the time by rivers. And from global circulation models and observations from Cassini spacecraft, the relative frequencies of winds and overland flows that could transport sand was constrained, and it's thought to be about 1 to 10% of the time, with the proportion at which transport could occur by winds varying with latitude. Near the equator, all transport occurs virtually in the aeolian environment. It's very dry, very few surface flows, very rare surface flows, whereas the frequency of fluvial flows that are capable of transporting sediments increases near the poles. Now, adding our climate constraints here, we predict that 150 to 300 micron equilibrium grains should form near the equator, which is consistent with the optimal grain size for siltation on Titan. We also predict the production of similar, perhaps slightly coarser sand grains near the poles, with equilibrium grain sizes around 200 to 400 microns. So what could this all mean for Titan's sedimentary cycle? Well, we showed that a continuous supply of sand-sized materials could exist at equatorial and high latitudes where winds and or flows capable of transporting sand are relatively frequent. We've also shown that intermittent transport and sintering could lead to the formation of saltatable sand near the equator, where the dunes actually are, and perhaps slightly coarser sand near the poles. We also know that some sediments produced at high and low latitudes are transported towards the mid latitudes. And as ground moisture increases from the equator towards the mid and high latitudes, eolian wind-driven transport becomes less efficient despite relatively frequent winds, possibly creating a lull in transport frequency around the mid latitudes. And sediments that accumulate at mid latitudes and aren't transported as frequently, well, under our model, they could sinter into coarser grains and possibly progressively turn into rocks into a process we call diagenesis. So this mechanism could explain the formation of Titan's undifferentiated plains, a scenario that is consistent with spectral observations suggesting a possible organic composition for large portions of the undifferentiated plains. And coarser organic sand grains that would be produced at high latitudes could also eventually get deposited into terminal basins. This is where we see the lakes, right? And in the presence of soluble cements, diagenesis again may occur, turning these sandy deposits into widespread organic sandstone, as has been proposed by Malaska and others in 2020, which in turn could be responsible for the formation of Titan's karst-like labyrinth terrains. Now, there is significant uncertainty as to what the materials that actually make up sand on Titan are and their properties as well, leaving some pretty fundamental questions open, like what is Titan sand actually made of? How does it form in the first place? And can these materials even sinter at all at the frigid temperatures of Titan's surface? That being said, inspired by the mechanics of fluid formation, we showed, based on our current understanding of possible sediment materials on Titan, that episodic abrasion and sintering of organic sand driven by Titan seasons could explain the latitudinal distribution of Titan's landscapes. Next, I will take you back to the inner solar system and think about the formation of rivers in landscapes that are devoid of plant life and what it means for the landscapes of the early Earth and of early Mars. So this work was conducted primarily in collaboration with Alessandro Yalpi and has recently been taken over by a PhD student in my group, Michael Hassan. On Earth, we know that vegetation affects fluvial systems, the way they function and the way they get recorded into rocks. Notably, sedimentologists observe a dramatic shift in the architecture of fluvial deposits throughout the Paleozoic era. Fluvial deposits that predate the Silurian and Devonian periods typically consist of laterally extensive, relatively thin, but massive sandstones without significant floodplain mudstones. And in contrast, around the Silurian and Devonian periods, a lot more mud rocks appear next to fluvial sandy deposits. And fluvial deposits start displaying clear channel bodies, a lot more mud, especially in the floodplains, as well as what we call heterolithic lateral accretion sets, which are these characteristic inclined layers of alternated sandy and muddy beds. And to date, these heterolithic lateral accretion sets have been used as a diagnostic indicator of river meandering. And as a result, the transition we see in the rock record was interpreted as a revolution in the planform geometry of rivers, with before the Silurian deposits being interpreted as having been formed by wide and shallow graded rivers or sheet graded rivers, kind of like what you see in the left picture. And after the Silurian observation being interpreted as indicative of the rise of point bar deposits, which are typically thought to be the diagnostic of single thread meandering streams. And interestingly, the fuzzy boundary where meandering seems to appear in the rock record roughly coincides with the advent and diversification of land plants, going from the rise of land plants to the appearance of roots and leaves to seeds and finally to the appearance of trees. In addition, many scientists have attempted to make rivers meander in the lab, and to this date, very few actually succeeded. And many of those who did succeed did so by seeding their plume with alfalfa sprouts. So some went as far as saying that plants are required for rivers to meander. And that could potentially explain then the transition that we see in the rock record. But something doesn't sit quite right with this hypothesis. As planetary scientists, we know that if we look at Mars, which most realistically never hosted anything as complex as a land plant, we clearly recognize the deposits of meandering rivers. Not only do we see these sinuous ridges, which are the remnants of amalgamated channel bodies, but we can see evidence for a lateral migration of the channel in the form of what we call scroll bars and these abandoned meander loops. So we know there were meandering rivers on Mars. So here I'll briefly show you how we have started testing 3 hypotheses regarding the formation of meandering rivers in unvegetated landscapes. And those 3 hypotheses are: 1, that plants made meandering possible; 2, plants affect the shape and dynamics of meanders; and 3, plants affect the deposits of meandering rivers. The first hypothesis is that plants made meandering possible. And a corollary to that hypothesis then is that meandering is not possible without plants. Now, here's I'm showing a drone picture of the Amargosa River in Death Valley. And as you can tell, it doesn't bode well for hypothesis number 1. Here is another drone picture taken in the Columbus Basin of Nevada, in which you can see again beautiful meanders, point bars, and even a nice meander cutoff. Until fairly recently, modern unvegetated meandering rivers had virtually gone unnoticed. And that's largely because there are few of them and they're located in remote, arid basins. Now, today we understand that such systems are few, not because they cannot exist, but because it's just really difficult to find a place on Earth where there's no vegetation. So to date, we've visited a little over a handful of unvegetated meandering rivers in the Western United States. And although I don't have time to expand on this point because I have a lot of other cool stuff to discuss, we developed a conceptual physics-based model for the formation of single-thread rivers in unvegetated but mud-rich substrates, and showed that single-thread rivers may indeed readily form in unvegetated landscapes, consistent with all of our field observations at all of these locations. So are plants really needed for rivers to meander? Well, I took a little bit of a shortcut here, but I hope that at least the drone photos convinced you that the answer is no, and that mud and riverbanks can provide sufficient strength for flow to stay confined within a single thread channel. And this implies that meandering rivers should have existed long before plants. We just don't really know how to recognize them once they're recorded into rocks. And that's a big problem, not only for our understanding of the early Earth, but also for the way we're going to decipher the sedimentary record of Mars. So next we tested hypothesis number 2, which is that plants affect the shape and dynamics of meanders. So to do that, we compiled the morphometrics of meandering rivers across the globe in both vegetated and unvegetated landscapes, spanning all climate zones but polar, and a range of tectonic settings. Starting with shape, and specifically here, we're looking at the width to depth ratio of the river channel. I'm showing channel depth as a function of channel width, with unvegetated rivers in blue and vegetated ones in green. And essentially, we don't see any significant differences in the width to depth ratio of vegetated and unvegetated meandering rivers. We also looked at other morphometric properties such as sinuosity and really did not detect any significant differences. So next we measured and compiled the lateral migration rate of both vegetated and unvegetated rivers from historical satellite imagery. And here the story is actually different. Although both vegetated and unvegetated rivers display a clear correlation between migration rate and the width of the channel, unvegetated meandering rivers migrate about 10 times faster than vegetated ones for a given channel width. And that will have implications for the way that those rivers get recorded into rocks. So finally, the third hypothesis we wanted to test is whether plants affect the deposits of meandering rivers. And specifically, we wanted to see whether we could identify any significant differences with those of vegetated meandering rivers. And to do so, we've conducted field investigations of the deposits of such rivers in the Great Basin. Here I'm showing you a set of trenches that we dug at Shoshone Creek in Nevada, for example. In addition to trenching, we also flew a drone to get a better sense of the organization of the floodplain and map the floodplain. And I won't nerd out too much about detailed sedimentology with this audience, but together, our observations allowed us to put together a stratigraphic model for the deposits of unvegetated meandering rivers. And in brief, this stratigraphic model is a lot more reminiscent of sandy braided rivers than of the deposits of meandering rivers that form in the presence of vegetation. So to briefly summarize, how do plants affect meanders in their deposits? We did not see any significant effect on geometry, but we did notice that plants slow down channel lateral migration a lot. And for that reason, the deposits of unvegetated versus vegetated meanders look very different, with unvegetated meander deposits looking a lot more like those of sandy braided rivers than those of vegetated meandering rivers. So going back to the broader picture here, our results suggest that there's no reason for pre-Silurian rivers to have all been braided, and different types of rivers almost certainly coexisted, but just didn't have appropriate tools to recognize them in the rock record. And this has profound implications for the way we approach paleohydrology on the early Earth, and more importantly, again, on Mars. Because there's no plate tectonics on Mars, the remnants of billion-year-old meandering streams, some of the earliest sedimentary records that we have in the solar system, have been preserved. In that sense, Mars could provide a unique snapshot of how Earth's early meanders behaved, how Earth's lifeless landscapes operated. So back in February 2021, the Perseverance rover landed in Jezero crater on Mars, where an ancient meandering river once flowed into a lake and formed a delta, the Jezero Delta, the remnants of which you can see here. And on top of the delta lie the deposits of ancient sinuous channels that used to swipe across the delta top. So here I'm showing some of the first observations of delta deposits by the Perseverance rover. Of course, the delta investigation is still ongoing. It actually started a little less than a month ago, I believe now. And our findings about the deposits of unvegetated meanders have implications for the distribution of fine-grained sequences, mud, and the fluvial deposits within the delta, which in turn is particularly important because mudstones are thought to be some of the best targets for astrobiology, because they're really good at preserving organics over really long timescales. So I'm very excited to see how the exploration of Jezero's fluvial lacustrine deposits unfold and how observed fluvial deposits compare with those that we've explored on Earth. And I anticipate that these deposits will teach us a lot about how to interpret Earth's pre-vegetation fluvial record once we get up close. So wrapping up this example with a couple of open questions, we still don't know how common were meandering rivers before the evolution of landforms. We don't know how much of Earth's record was misinterpreted, or for example, how aridity or hydroclimate would influence the architecture of those deposits. Now, despite these questions, it's clear that Earth's pre-vegetation fluvial record is likely much more similar to Mars's than it is to the modern terrestrial fluvial record. And unfortunately, most of that record on Earth was lost to plate tectonics or altered by metamorphism and deformation, whereas it's still sitting at the surface of Mars in a near pristine state. So exploring Mars can teach us about Earth's past in ways that Earth simply cannot anymore. And finally, we're going to stay on Mars for my third and last example. And I will tell you about how an observation we made on another planet, Mars, taught us about a fundamental geological process, which is the formation of sand ripples by winds. This work is the result of discussions and collaboration with several people, primarily Ryan Ewing and Mike Lamb, but also Carlos Alvarez, a postdoc in my group, as well as John Gotzinger, Dave Rubin, and Christine Swan. when one thinks of a sandy desert on Earth, the top picture is kind of the mental picture they built. Large dunes mantled by small kind of decimeter scale ripples. And on Mars, this is what we see here at the bottom. That picture is cropped from a mosaic of mass camera images acquired by NASA's Curiosity rover in Gale Crater when it crossed a field of basaltic sand dunes. That's why the sand is dark. So here to the right, I'm showing you the distributions of bedform wavelength or crest-to-crest spacing on both planets. And on both planets, you can see that sandy deserts have a mode of bedforms with decimeter scale wavelengths. These are the small ripples you can see in the pictures to the left. And we also see 100-meter to kilometer scale bedforms on both planets, and these are the big dunes, like the ones shown on the right. But of course, on Mars, we're left with this intermediate peak at 2 to 3 meters that corresponds to these large ripples. These are nowhere to be found on Earth. It's important to note that there are real gaps in bedform wavelength, around 20 to 80 centimeters, and then again between 20 and 80 meters, completely separating the large Martian ripples from other bedform types. They are distinct from small ripples, and they are distinct from large dunes. Now, in addition to having different sizes, they also look different from any other bedform. They can have sinuous crests. Some are asymmetric. They almost look like breaking waves on the ocean surface with shallow upwind slopes and steep near angle of repose downwind faces. And they're often associated with grain fall deposits, which are these smooth blankets of grains that settle out of suspension past the ripple's crest, and grain flow deposits, which are these little avalanche deposits, little avalanches here. So how do the large Martian ripples form? Well, on Earth, the formation of eolian ripples is thought to be intimately tied to siltation, or the hopping of sand grains through an impact mechanism. You can imagine that if you have wind blowing from left to right here over a bumpy sand bed, and grains are hopping around, the grains are resting along the upwind facing side of a bump will be preferentially exposed to potential impacts by incoming siltating grains, and will thus preferentially be splashed away. And conversely, grains resting along the downwind side of a bump are located within the shadow zone cast by the bump's topography that protects these grains from being impacted and splashed away. And as a result, grains are preferentially removed from the upwind side of the bumps and accumulate along the downwind side of the bump, leading to the growth and migration of so-called impact ripples. And before we knew that small ripples coexisted with the large ones on Mars, it was thought that perhaps the low gravity and atmospheric pressure led to longer siltation trajectories on Mars, and could explain maybe the longer ripple wavelengths that we could see from orbit through a similar mechanism. However, this single mechanism cannot explain the equal occurrence of both scales of ripples if they form in well-sorted, kind of unimodally distributed sand sizes. So another possibility is that the large Martian ripples are coarse-grained ripples, such as the ones that were observed by the Spirit rover at El Dorado, or the Curiosity rover itself in sand sheets outside of the dune field. And both of these hypotheses, that the large ripples are impact ripples forming in bimodal sand, or that they are coarse-grained ripples, require the presence of a coarse-grained population. So there's a very easy test that we could conduct here. So we took a closer look at sand grains with Molly, which is the microscopic imager on board Curiosity. This is Curiosity here taking a selfie in front of one of the dunes. You can see the crater rim to the top left here, and just behind Curiosity, you can see the central mound, Mount Sharp. And wherever we saw small ripples migrating on top of large ripples, which themselves piggyback into a larger dunes, we found that the sand that makes up these bed forms is relatively fine and well sorted. So we don't think that the large Martian ripples are either impact ripples or coarse-grained ripples. Now, there's another type of bed forms that those large Martian ripples resemble, but those are not formed by winds, but by water on Earth's riverbeds. I'm talking about current ripples, which you can see a set of them here in the top right picture that formed on top of larger river bars. The ripples themselves are asymmetric and sinuous, just like our large Martian ripples. But in water on Earth, they form at about 12 centimeter wavelengths, and they're distinct from fluvial dunes, which are larger kind of meter wavelength. And in contrast to the impact ripples formed by the wind, current ripples form from a hydrodynamic instability. As water accelerates upstream of a defect going upslope because of flow contraction, fluid drag causes entrainment of the grains and thus erosion, while flow expansion past the break in slope causes sediment deposition, which ultimately leads to the growth and migration of current ripples. So to investigate a potential fluid drag origin for the equilibrium size of large Martian ripples, we performed a dimensional analysis. Parameters that govern the size of fluid drag ripples are grain size, E, the specific submerged weight of the grains, shear velocity, which is a measure of flow velocity very close to the granular bed, and the kinematic viscosity of the fluid, which together with shear velocity dictates the thickness of the the viscous sublayer. So based on the number of parameters and their dimensions, one can show that the problem can be recast in terms of three dimensionless quantities. And in fact, Yalin in 1985 showed experimentally that the problem can be further reduced into two dimensionless quantities. The first dimensionless quantity we chose to use is a dimensionless wavelength, lambda star, which can also be seen as a ripple scale Reynolds number. And the second number we chose is the Yalin number, which can be written as a Reynolds number, where the length scale is the sediment transport saturation length, which is complicated jargon to say that it relates to the details of sediment transport. And the formulation of that saturation length scale depends on the dominant mode of transport. For subaqueous ripples, the dominant mode of transport is through bed load, and the Yalin number can be written as a function of the particle Reynolds number and the shield stress. And in turn, the particle Reynolds number is just a measure of how much grain sitting on the bed sticks outside of the viscous sublayer. And the Shields number is a measure of flow strength relative to stabilizing gravitational forces. So here I'm plotting our dimensionless wavelength on the y-axis as a function of the Yalin number of various bed forms. Here I'm showing current ripples on Earth in blue, the blue circles, and they plot along this power law of exponent 1/3, which is shown by this line labeled fluid drag scaling relationship here. And as expected, the Martian dunes and small ripples plot off of this trend, right? We know that these are not hydrodynamic bed forms. However, the size of the large Martian ripples seems to be fairly well predicted by our scaling relationship, which supports our interpretation that the equilibrium size of large Martian ripples is set by a hydrodynamic mechanism. And this conclusion is further supported by looking at the distribution of large ripple wavelength globally on Mars in dimensional form. So putting everything back in dimensional space, here I'm plotting ripple wavelength on the y-axis as a function of atmospheric density on the x-axis. And thanks to Mars's very large range in surface atmospheric density today, we are able to measure ripple wavelengths over areas that span over an order of magnitude in atmospheric density. And one key observation we made was that the wavelength of these large ripples decreases with increasing atmospheric density. And it does so in a way that is quantitatively consistent, matched fairly well by our scaling law relationship. So this is really cool because one can imagine that if those ripples get fossilized, right, they turn into rocks, it may be possible to use those ripples as a proxy for paleoatmospheric density. In order to use ripples as a proxy for paleoclimate, though, we need to understand how sediment translates into sedimentary structures in the rock record. And in particular, what is the stratigraphic signature or the cross-stratification of those bed forms that we don't really have on Earth? Now, the geometry of preserved cross-stratification is a function of the geometries and migration directions of the various scales of bed forms, and also of the rate of sediment deposition relative to the bed form migration rates. So here is an example of a population of sinuous bed forms migrating obliquely on top of a larger bed form. And in cross-section, you can see the corresponding cross strata or cross sets that are formed by the migration of those bed forms. And because of their high sinuosity and their relative scale, the large ripples are expected to leave those trough-shaped, kind of smile-looking sets of strata at sizes that are simply too small to be formed by those left behind by the larger dews. And if we find such trough-shaped cross-sets in ancient aeolian sandstones on Mars, we can then infer the paleoenvironmental conditions under which the rocks were deposited. Because the thickness of those troughs scales with ripple height, and that ripple height scales with ripple wavelength, we can then use the thickness of those trough cross sets and combine it with our scaling relationship to invert for paleoatmospheric density. And in fact, we found preserved stratification from ancient large wind ripples on Mars. This is an example here from within the Burns Formation at Victoria Crater. This picture was taken by the Opportunity rover back in 2005, I believe. And based on the thickness of the trough cross sets that we observed at Victoria Crater, we inferred a range in wavelength that is here given by the height of the red box on this diagram. And when combined with our scaling relationship, yields a range in paleoatmospheric density that strongly overlaps with the modern atmospheric density. So this finding supports the idea of a thin atmosphere at the time of deposition of the Burns Formation sandstone about 3.7 billion years ago. So this last example was an instance where surprising observations from Mars challenged our understanding of one of the most fundamental sedimentary structures there is, sand ripples, illustrating how exploring other planets allows us to probe unexplored parameter spaces. And in doing so, it opened a whole new set of questions that couldn't be tackled before. For example, we observed large eolian ripples stratigraphically bounded by fluvial-lacustrine deposits at Gill Crater, possibly suggesting periods of atmospheric collapse followed by aqueous episodes, offering unique insights into Mars's transition from a wet planet to the cold and arid desert it is today. So one can imagine that this could also have important implications for our understanding, of course, of Earth's Archean atmosphere. So through this high-level kind of sample platter of some of our group's research, I hope that I've convinced you that a lot can be learned through comparative planetology in terms of surface processes. First, drawing a comparison between the formation of calcium carbonate ooids on Earth and hydrocarbon sand on Titan allowed us to build a self-consistent mechanistic model for Titan sedimentary pathways in response to the moon's climate that is capable of explaining the distribution of Titan's landscapes. Second, we showed that the study of the early Earth, and in particular Earth before the advent of macroscopic life on land, could benefit from the exploration of ancient Martian sedimentary deposits. And third, by providing a full-scale experiment in which sandy deserts form under a low-density atmosphere, Mars revolutionized the way geoscientists think about one of the most fundamental landforms there is. So to conclude briefly, I'll just say that quantitative models for surface processes developed from observations on Earth can be applied to learn about the hydrology, climate, environments, and habitability of other planetary bodies. And in turn, the diversity of planetary bodies in the solar system offers a wealth of new data that often challenges our understanding of geological processes. And it's really this dialogue between the Earth and planetary sciences that, in my opinion, offers one of the most exciting and promising avenues to decipher the history of rocky worlds, at least in our own solar system. Thank you.
Many thanks, Mathieu. That was a fascinating tour through many different places in the solar system. So we have some time for questions. I have the chat open, so I'll be able to see if you raise your hands, or alternatively, just put text in the chat. And I see that Claire's raised her hand, so go ahead, Claire.
Hello. Yeah, first off, thank you for great and really clear talk. Sorry for asking the first question, which is maybe asking you to speculate a little bit, but is there any reason why a planet wouldn't have meandering rivers? And are there any consequences of that for like the overall fluvial erosion or transport?
Yeah, no, this is a great question. So meandering rivers basically to form a meandering river, you need to have some kind of cohesive agent that provides sufficient strength to the riverbanks for the channel to hold its fluid discharge within a single deep channel. If you don't have that cohesion, that strength, then the flow is going to widen, spread, and form these, braided streams. Now, again, it was thought that on Earth we needed vegetation to do that. It turns out that now we know that other agents that provide cohesion to the riverbanks can actually make meandering rivers form. Mud is one that works really well on Earth. And we know there's a lot of clay minerals on Mars, so mud probably also worked on Mars. Now, of course, extending this to more exotic surface materials, I can only speculate, but again, I think as long as there are cohesive materials at the surface and that cohesion is high enough for the channel to become deep enough that you can start developing a helicoidal flow in meander bends. This gets a little bit deep into the hydrodynamics of meander bends. Then you will be able to form meanders on other planets. For example, on Titan, I can only imagine that you could potentially form meandering rivers in ice, because ice obviously will be very cohesive, especially at those temperatures. Water ice, those meanders would probably be incised as opposed to depositional, but they would still be meanders. When it comes to the organics, I have no idea. We don't have any sense of what their cohesive properties could be. But in brief, again, I can only speculate, but as long as the surface materials have some cohesion, I think you should be able to form meanders.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great. I have a follow-up to that question, but Ollie's raised his hand, so I'm going to let him go first.
Thanks, Robin. Yes, so mine was a follow-up as well, which is that I kind of understood that part of the conversation around the transition in the sedimentary record in Earth from plants was associated with a change in like the mud fraction on the continents. So even if the plants weren't directly adding strength to the banks of rivers, they could have changed clay mineral production or something like that and changed the character of the sediment in rivers, which itself is what did the work in terms of allowing meandering rivers to form. So is it the case that your kind of examples from the modern Earth where you see meandering are themselves indirectly influenced by plant action because there are clay minerals around in those basins that ultimately are the product of an environment which has been shaped by plants, even if the plants aren't directly there to do the strengthening, with the result that actually we would still expect meandering rivers to be rare pre-vegetation if we accept that a consequence of plants was clay mineral or fine production. Does that make sense? Sorry, that became quite a long question, but
yeah, this is a great question, and it's actually one of the big debates that is naturally following our findings, right? Those are debates that are going on in the literature right now. To that, I will say a couple of things. One is, clays are formed even without life through the circuit weathering cycle. And even though plants might have transiently enhanced clay production, it's unclear that on the long term, they can really change. They can really modify the circuit weathering kind of budget. There are fights about this in the literature. I am no expert, but we do see a lot of mud in the Precambrian, so before land plants. The only thing, though, is that the mudstones we see in the Precambrian have been interpreted as marine, but they are still detrital in origin, so they're still thought to be formed from not in situ, but to have been deposited there. that makes sense. And so there are a few possibilities. One, they're not actually marine, and they've been misinterpreted because it turns out that before we knew that meandering rivers, before land plans could form deposits that looked like those of braided rivers, anything that had mud was interpreted as marine because there was mud, right? This is before we have any fossils. So we have very few things we can use to determine paleoenvironment. The presence of mud, an abundance of mud, is actually used to diagnose a marine environment. So there could be some misinterpretation there, just because of the kind of circularity of the argument. Two, most likely, a lot of what's been interpreted as marine is actually marine. I'm not trying to say everybody was wrong at all. But those clays were still formed on the continents. But instead of having some of it stored on the continents, preserved in the rock record, they were just kind of bypassed towards the ocean. And that's one other possibility. And in that case, you would only expect then to form meandering rivers, at least those mediated by mud-rich materials in endorheic basins. But we don't really have reasons to think that those should have been rare on the early Earth, especially during times of supercontinental assembly. So maybe they were rare. That's why I said, we don't really know how common they were. All we can say so far is that they definitely existed. They should have existed. They could still have been rare. I'm not sure they should have been, but maybe.
Cool. Thanks very much. That's a really helpful answer.
Oh, I'll just add that on Mars, of course, we don't have plants and we have lots of clays. We have the CO2-rich atmosphere and the mafic surface that help in producing the clays, of course.
Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, and this, I think, ties into lots of fascinating questions about what plants actually did to the surface when they arose and to what extent the surface was biologically altered in the Precambrian, because of course it wasn't a completely dead surface. There would have been bacterial mats and other things present there. I was actually, I'd like to lead the discussion back to your part about Titan, if that's possible, because I was curious about the implications that you were arguing for the way in which the grains are forming. At one point, there were implications for intermittency in the wind in particular, and I was curious about that in the context of Titan's atmospheric circulation. And it's a slow rotator, so it's in a weak temperature gradient regime, and I'm curious to what extent we can see from, say, mesoscale modeling that winds should be highly intermittent in the planetary boundary layer. Is that something that's well accepted?
No, I mean, these mostly come from, these intermittencies for the winds mostly come from modeling, as you said, and there's very little, I don't even know if there's any observation that we can help to ground truth that in terms of intermittency. So there's a couple papers that came out recently. I think there's a paper by Tocano in which he tried to get at the intermittency. This is where I got the values that I used. There's also another paper that is more based on the mechanics of sediment transport that argued that transport must be intermittent based on the presence of the dunes. But this is another, I mean, Titan is Titan. The data we have is, well, Well, granted, it's probably better than anything we have on, I mean, it definitely is better than what we have on exoplanets, but by solar system standards, it's not great. So I think until we get there with Dragonfly, anything is possible.
Yeah, I mean, from a physical standpoint, there's like strong thermodynamic reasons to expect the moist convection should be highly intermittent. So it might just be that the winds are tied to that on a local scale, but it's interesting motivation for future investigation.
Yeah, I agree.
Any further questions? All right, well, in that case, let's thank the speaker one more time through our use of emojis. And before you all leave, I just want to remind everyone that there is our next Rocky Worlds discussion meeting is going to be on the 3rd of August, 1300 hours UTC, and it's going to be Satoshi Okazumi. So please tune into that. That would be another fascinating talk. Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.